Hi, in this video, I'm going to build off how to build your first online app and continue on showing how to authenticate using the claims that were passed back from the federated authentication service. You can see that the code is very similar to the first video. The only difference is now I've gotten rid of the JWT token information. We're only going to be extracting the SAML token, and as long as that's not null, we're going to go ahead and instantiate a super ID token handler, and using the token handler, we'll validate the token, getting back our super ID token data type, which contains all of our claims. I'm going to go ahead and set that into the session. So I'm going to pass that into session using the super ID token as a key. And then what we want to do is be able to authenticate using the SuperOffice services. Now, in order to do that, I actually need the SuperOffice services in the references. Those are not located here yet because all we've done is make a reference to the SuperOffice online package. See, and that included these three DLLs: superoffice.online.core, superoffice.superid.client, and superoffice.superid.contracts. If we look at the packages config, we can see that we had only made a reference to superoffice.crm.online.core, which included those three libraries. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now all I'm going to do is type in install package and specify superoffice.netserver.services. Now this works regardless if you're working in online or on site. And what it's also going to do is download and install the superoffice.netserver.core package as well. That's a dependency. Great, now that's installed. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the packages file. We can now see that SuperOffice.NET Server Core is there and SuperOffice.NET Server Services. So I'll close packages. Let's take a look at the changes in the web config. Here you can see it's added in the SuperOffice section group. And then down below, it also includes the SuperOffice section. Now in on-site installations, the database section becomes very important, the whole data section. It basically tells the installation when you try and authenticate and work with the APIs where the database is located, what's the server name, what's the database name, to build up the connection string, including the database user and the database password. When we're working online, we don't necessarily need those things. We will have to change the type of mode, but not necessarily for this example right now. We'll come back to that later. All we want to focus on now is the services section. So here in the services section, it defaults to a mode equal to local. And of course, local means working with a local database. So I want to go ahead and switch this over to remote because we're working with remote web services. So I'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll come back to our contact controller and start writing our code. Now that we have installed the NuGet package, it also includes all of the SuperOffice libraries, SO Core, SO Database, SO License, and then all of the services as well that we're going to need to work with. So let's go ahead, I'll close that up, and we'll go ahead and start writing. First thing you want to do in order to enable isolation is you want to be able to establish a database context. So I'm going to go ahead and say a using statement here because a database context is a disposable object. So I'm going to go ahead and put that inside there. And I'll just start typing in superoffice.database. And you can see database context appears. And then I want the database context type. And I'll say context equals. And then here I'm going to choose enter in the database context. And what it passes in is a string. It expects a context identifier. So I'm going to go ahead and take that out of the tokens, the token that was given to me, and pass in the context identifier here. And that context identifier is just going to be the customer ID. So now when I come down inside here, what I want to be able to do is authenticate against this user's installation. So I can also use another using statement, and here I'll type in superoffice.session, because that's what I want to establish is a session equals superoffice.session.authenticate. Now, what we're going to use to authenticate here is it expects a username and a password. For the username, we're going to use the ticket. That's what you use when you authenticate and you have a ticket. Instead of the username, you pass in the ticket. So we'll say superID token dot ticket, and then the password is just going to be an empty field. Now here we want to be able to get some data. Let's just use a var here in order to capture the principal, and I'll say session dot principal. And that's all we need to do. And I'm going to use this really just to set a breakpoint. So let's go ahead and set that breakpoint. And now let's go ahead and try and authenticate and see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and set my first breakpoint up here so that we can step through it and watch the callback occur. Okay, we've got my default application page, and I'll choose login. And if you remember, that calls into the callbacks login method. Here it tells me I want to authenticate to the application Acme Colors. Tony at superoffice.com is correct. Just type in my credentials and click login. And of course, the callback URL should be our application for local development. And here we go. We're in the callback. We've got the SAML token, got the token handler. We've validated the claims, and here's all my information. So here what I want to do is set the SuperID token into the current HTTP context current session. So I'll go ahead and I'll step over that. And now I'm going to establish that database context. If we expand on that, it's really not much to show, just that the context identifier is established for my customer ID. And then I'm going to go ahead and try to authenticate. And you'll see here I get an exception. If I view the details, I'm going to come down in here and it's going to explain to me that it's unable to determine a version of web services. And that's because built in, I need to be able to specify the endpoint for the services I want to communicate to. Since all of this is happening in a dynamic manner, I can't set this here in my remote base URL of the web config. This is not what you want to do. You do not want to have to change this here. You want to be able to have that happen dynamically in your code. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the debugging for a moment, and I'll set that right here. Since we're going to enter in the database context and we know what our net server URL is for this particular user, so the best way to do that is just set it directly inside the superoffice.configuration.config file .web base URL. And then we'll go ahead and set that to the superID token.net server URL. Here we go. So let's go ahead and try and run this again and see what happens. Here's the application login page. I'll click login. I've already logged into SuperOffice SuperID, so I don't need to do that again. Here we go. I'll just step over this. Here we'll go ahead, we'll see that the remote base URL currently is what was set in the web config file, but we don't want that. We want to go ahead and set it to our online instance. So I'll go ahead and step over that. And now we'll try to authenticate again, and I get yet another exception. If I view the details, it says that authentication failed. If I look at inner exceptions, they basically tell me that the WCF method failed on the server. Why? Well, the reason why is because we haven't established the application token. Remember, the application ID is required to authenticate into SuperID, the federated login page, it tells where the user should be redirected to for this specific application. But we also need that application token. You don't need to specify specifically here in code. This is something that you can do also in the web config because this is your web application. Therefore, it's always going to be the same. The place to specify your application token is here inside the services element. So I'm going to go ahead and drop in a new key and then we'll continue. Okay, now we've got the application token defined. Here inside the services element, I've got a new key called application token. And if you recall from the previous video in our email received from SuperOffice, they gave us this application token. So let's go ahead, save this, come back to the controller, and we'll run the example again, see how it works now. So we'll go ahead and click login again. We'll be redirected back to our app. Here we go. Step over all this code, set the remote base URL. Now it's trying to authenticate. Let's go ahead and do that. Now it has a application token that it's able to pass into that authenticate method as it sends it to the web services. Now we've authenticated and I have a valid session. I can go ahead and just step over that in order to set the principal, and then I can expand on the principal and we can see, in fact, my user has been authenticated and the properties associated with my user. Okay, so while all of this is useful, it becomes a little bit impractical when you want to be able to use SuperOffice NetServer queries in another controller dealing with other views. Basically, what I mean is you don't want to have to establish a database context, set the web service endpoints, and then authenticate every time you want to use the services in subsequent code. So the way to avoid that is to establish a context initializer and a context resolver so that we can get rid of at least these two lines of code above here. And once you authenticate, you'll only have to authenticate once in the callback controller, and then you'll still have access to an authenticated SuperOffice session in the controllers for the rest of the lifetime of your application. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to do that. Inside the app data folder, I'm going to go ahead and include a couple files. First, I want to go ahead and stop the debugger, and I'm going to go ahead and include a context initializer and a context resolver class. So let's go ahead and include in project. Take a look at these. The context resolver is trying to establish a database context or a context for the current user when I authenticate. So when I call sosession.authenticate, first thing it's going to do is call the context initializer and try and establish a context. It's going to pass me in a context identifier, and here I'm going to pull the one out of the session that we stored in session, and as long as that's not null and that context identifier equals the one that's being passed in, it's going to go ahead and set the remote base URL to the context's netserver URL string. Next is the context resolver, and then try and resolve context is going to be called. It's going to be passing in some security tokens. Here I'm going to pull the context out of session, and as long as it exists, then I'm going to go ahead and set the context identifier equal to the context identifier we stored in session. And of course, that's an out parameter, so then it will be passed out. Append security token is necessary if you want to add additional security tokens to this context, but in this case, it's not useful. So again, context initializer will be called a second time, and this time it's going to pass in the correct context identifier that does equal the one that we have in the session. So then it's going to establish the remote base URL. Then it's always going to know where to communicate for this particular SO session that's been authenticated. But it doesn't end there, because we want to be able to not just establish the context, but we also want to establish the container for the authenticated session. By default, I'm going to open up my web config file, and I'm going to scroll up a little bit, but I also did say that we come back and take a look at this mode. This mode by default is set to thread, which basically means the SuperOffice session, the authenticated session, is going to exist on a specific thread, on only one thread. So if we authenticate in the callback controller on, let's say, thread number 1, and we set that here, the context is going to be established on the thread, but it's only this thread. So if your user in your website or in the browser communicates to the web server again and then is given thread number 2, that validated or authenticated context is no longer going to be available because now you're on thread 2, not on thread 1. So what we want to do is be able to make a new context container that will be available on all threads for this particular user. So the way to do that is we've created this new class called HTTP Context Provider, which inherits from an ISO container type, and that's of course inside the SuperOffice core libraries. What's important here is to decorate this with a SO context provider attribute. And I'm going to specify partner HTTP context as the name. And that is what I'm going to put inside the web config file. Let's first go ahead, include this in the project so that it builds with the site. I'm going to go down to the web config file. I'm going to change the mode from thread to partner HTTP context. That matches the attribute name. And then just take a quick look at this class. It's got a provider constant string, which is going to be the key into the current context session collection. So that's where we're going to establish the container, is inside the session. So when it sets it, we're going to come down here. It's going to be passed in. It's going to look for it, make sure it's not null, and set that into the current context session. Then when it's going to when it needs a valid session, it's going to go ahead and look for it, called the get current context, and it's going to go ahead and make sure there's an HTTP context available, and then pull that out of the context session again. So that's basically all that's required, is to set this SO container for holding onto our authenticated session. So let's go ahead and close all that. Let's go ahead and build it, make sure that it builds. The rebuild was successful. So let's go back to the callback controller, and we'll clean this up a little bit. So now with the context initializer and context resolver there, we're going to be able to replace some of these lines of code. I no longer need to explicitly set the database context because that's what the context initializers are doing. And then I no longer have to set the remote base URL because that's also going to be done inside the context initializer. So let's go ahead and get rid of those few lines of code. And then let's go ahead and run this and see how this works. The application's running. I'm going to go ahead and click login. Super ID will recognize the application ID, and upon successfully authenticating, redirect me back to the application. And here we go. I'm just going to go ahead and step over setting the session, and then I'm going to click authenticate. And now we step into the initializer. So it's the context initializer, and here it's passing in the context identifier as default. Now those two are not going to equal, so let's just go ahead and see what happens. So it just goes ahead and returns. It does not set the remote base URL. So let's exit out of there. And here it's going to try and resolve the context identifier. So here we're in the context resolver. It's passed in our security token. We can expand on that. We can see it's our username is our ticket and an ID. And it's going to go ahead and pull that out of the session. And then it's going to take that context identifier that it found and is able to pull out of the session and set that to the out parameter, that out context identifier. It returns true. And here we are again in the context initializer, this time passing in the correct customer ID. So let's go ahead and step over that. And here's where it establishes that remote base URL. You can see the default actually is pulled from config file.services remote base URL, but we don't want that. We want to be able to establish this for a multi-tenant environment. So we're going to set it to config file.webservices.remote base URL, and that's the remote base URL that was passed back to us from SuperID. So we'll step out of there, and we're not going to append any more security tokens. Here we're trying to get out the session from the container. We don't need to do that, so I'm just going to hit continue. And you can see now we've got a valid session. It's got a good principal, and there's my information for that current user. So that's using the context initializer and using the context resolver, and also using the context provider, which acts as a container for the current session, the SuperOffice session. So we're going to look a little bit more at these in the following videos, but just to summarize in this video, what you've learned is how to authenticate against the tenant's web services using the security token that was passed back to you, all here in the callback controller. So just in summary again, we took out the SAML token, we validated that SAML token, we set the token into the session collection, and then we authenticated that session by establishing our context using the context initializer and context resolver plugins. In the next video, we'll take a look at how we can leverage an existing library that's created for you that will help simplify authentication routines in your web applications, both using ASP.NET MVC as well as web forms. Thanks for watching.